I want to begin by talking with you about, I guess, the beginning of this book and how it kind of originated for you creatively. I was reading up prior to our time together, and I want to read something you said, and then you can kind of respond, and we'll start there. But you said, I was initially invested in the immortality or the supposed immortality of LeBron James. That was the original seed. Is that accurate? Is that where things began?
I would say so. Yes, I was, he and I are around the same age, and we grew up in two different Ohio's, but in Ohio in the same era. And I began to think about mortality through the lens of him. I would say that's correct. Yes.
He's an incredible figure
Hmm.
in our contemporary cultural and sports era. And he's like one of these rare people in any field who kind of lived up to the hype. When I think about LeBron, I think about the enormous expectations placed on him from such a young age, the incredible amount of attention that he got from the time he was like, what, an eighth grader? I think that's kind of when it began.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
he's sort of measured up. And on top of that, he's a good guy by like every account I've read. Like I think of anybody being fawned over like that and being under that kind of microscope from the age of like 12 or 13 and coming up the way that he did, which was not necessarily easy. And he's basically been, there's never been a problem. You know what I'm saying? Like
No. Yeah. Yeah.
he's carried the weight of all of those expectations with a lot of grace.
Yeah. It seems like it. Yeah. I mean, um, yeah, it's a challenge to be in the public eye for that long and to have to compete in sport too, which is a unique way to be in the public eye, which requires a lot of other people's hopes and dreams being placed upon you, and then the vitriol from not fulfilling those hopes and dreams, or in some cases fulfilling them for someone else. And so, yeah, I mean, it's a lot. It's a lot, I think, on the brain, and on the body and on the ego. And so, the fact that he's just kind of been able to handle it and manage it is fascinating to me.
When did you first become aware of him?
When he was in ninth grade, or at least that's when I first saw him. I think you heard rumors when he was in eighth grade. But I think ninth grade was when I first came aware of him, and he was in ninth grade when I was in 10th grade. Um, and I saw a quick clip of him. But I saw him in person in 10th grade. I went to go see a game in Akron. Akron St. Vincent St. Mary at that time, by the time he was a junior, senior, they couldn't play in their gym. They had to play in larger venues. But 10th grade, you could still catch them in the gym at Akron St. Vincent St. Mary every now and then. And so, for their home games. And so, yeah, you could make that drive, and there would be a line. You have to stand outside, but you could see him. Yeah, I saw him play in the 10th grade, and it was fascinating. I mean, that whole team, that Akron St. Vincent St. Mary team, was really fascinating. And, they had played together for so long that they were just, they just clicked. They just kind of were like a well-oiled machine that was running on its own.
Yeah, I grew up, like I was saying, I think before we came on, in Indiana, and I could totally relate to your depictions of high school basketball culture in Ohio and the hype around LeBron. I'm a little bit older than you are. And so for me and my generation in Indiana, there was this guy named Damon Bailey. I don't know if you ever remember him, but he was like,
Yeah.
like Bob Knight, who, for a long time in Indiana was sort of the de facto like commander in chief of Indiana. He could do anything. He had a lot of outsized power. And I remember he sort of pointed at Damon Bailey when he was in eighth grade and said, he's better than anybody on my team right now. So he was like a god. And then there was Glenn Robinson, and there was Alan Henderson.
Yeah.
I got to see those guys play, and I remember it so well, like going into those gyms just packed, and these guys, having to sort of live up to, or not, the expectations placed on them. It was pretty heady. And you grew up in East Columbus and continue to live there. I think there's a brief window of time in your life where you didn't live there, but you've spent basically all your life in Columbus, Ohio.
Yeah. I lived in New Haven, Connecticut for about 2.5 years, but largely, yeah, I've lived most of my life in Columbus, Ohio, and I would say now, I suppose the majority of it on the East Side to some degree.
So this book is about Ohio. It's about Columbus. It's about your neighborhood in East Columbus. It's about family. It's about basketball, as we've been discussing. It's about grief, beauty, the mythology of a place, the mythologies that can be tied to a person. It's about time. It's about belonging. It's about all of these different things. And it's unbelievable to me in reading this book, the ways in which you are able to start in one place and then sort of expand outward in what feels like almost like concentric circles or something. And you're able to draw resonances between seemingly disparate subject matter. And a lot of reviews note this. This is something I think that is a signature of your work, at least so far, using one subject as a lens through which to view the wider culture, or through a lens through which to view the deeper self, and then drawing through lines between disparate subject matters. And as a matter of craft and creativity, I want to ask you about how you do that, because to me, as a writer, I was imagining that you were finding a lot of these resonances in the writing, or is it something that you preconceive? Do you see them ahead of time and then write them that way? Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, I don't tend to see them ahead of time. I mean, I'm someone who really believes that the writing you do informs the writing to come, which means that I think my process relies on a kind of openness, and an openness to, I'm interested in being wrong and then writing my way to something that feels right. And that's what a lot of these connective threads are doing. Is I begin somewhere and I'm unsatisfied with where that takes me. And so I'm just kind of looking for something else to grab onto, to swing me to somewhere else, and then somewhere else, and then somewhere else. So a lot of this is very intently, thoughtfully process based in a way that it relies on me being unsatisfied with where I'm at and looking to go somewhere else almost immediately. And so that's kind of the process. It's I do want to start out in the broadest possible sense. So for example, in the pregame, to start with the concept of baldness, when I'm really asking some questions about impermanence, that gives me a lot of room to play. And the more room I have, the more directions I can take, but I don't know what those directions look like until I begin writing. And so the writing leads more writing.
So when you say you start in a place where you're kind of unhappy with where you are and you want to go somewhere else, does that mean in your life, or does it mean creatively?
Oh no, just creatively. I mean, to say, again, using the pregame example, just to say I want to write about my father's bald head, that's pretty dissatisfying to me on its own. I could do that and I could make some, but that's not, I think, as the most appealing form of writing for what I was attempting. But in order to write well about my father's bald head, I inevitably need to bring in other threads that might be more pleasing to pursue and that broaden the scope of what I'm actually writing about. So it's all about creative practice in terms of dissatisfaction. I'm kind of writing away from being dissatisfied with where I began and looking for somewhere else, and then somewhere else, and then somewhere else.
So you write fast, I've read, and you wrote, I want to say, a 120,000 word first draft of this book. And can you just talk about, like, I guess, first writing fast, and then maybe how you worked in the early stages on this book, especially in that first draft, and then what had to change between it and where you ultimately ended up?
Yeah, I mean, I think I write fast, but I think the longer process, which begins in my head and spends a lot of time in kind of gestating internally, that takes a while. But the reason that takes a while is because when it comes to just sitting down and putting words on the page, because I've lived with the thoughts and ideas for so long, it does come pretty easy to me. And so, when I'm in book mode, I tend to write about 3,000 words a day, 4 days a week for 2.5 months. And that's usually how a draft comes to fruition. But for this book, I didn't know. I thought overwriting would be important so that me and my editors, Maya Millett and Ben Greenberg, this was our second book in a row working together. And so, even having that continuity with each other allowed for us to do the work better than we would have had it been our first time together. And so I knew I could overwrite this book because the two of them with me would sit down and kind of trim to the heart of what it was doing. And so a lot of the overwriting in this book had to do with this anxiety that I think I was bringing to the process of making it. I wanted to make it a basketball book. You know, I was kind of thinking this has to be a basketball book. And the way I was imagining that was this very tangible recounting of events from basketball games. I mean, very literally just walking through basketball games, but that's not really good writing. It's just giving play by play of a thing that's happened. But to overwrite in that way allowed for some real good moments. Like, for example, there's the moment where I talk about Dick Snyder's floater in the 1976 playoffs, the Cavs against the Washington Bullets at the time, Bullets now Wizards. To overwrite that section allowed for the sharp, I think, the really sharp trick of the writing of that section, which was just me kind of repeating the image of the shot over and over again until the ball looked like a sun setting across the blue background of the arena. So, you know, sometimes you overshoot a word count or you overshoot a storytelling goal, but in that overshooting, once you kind of trim and back up, you find something good. And I think that was my goal with this, because I was making a book that looked like nothing I had ever seen before. And so I think I needed to overwrite so I could kind of trim around it and find the good.
Yeah, it is a formally inventive book, and it's structured like a basketball game. A lot of reviews have noted, like the four quarters, the timeouts, like the interstitial moments. There's poetic moments. There's sports writing. There's deeply personal memoir. Like, it's doing a lot of different things, and sometimes it's doing these things at the same time.
Sure.
And you mentioned your editors. Can you say their names again?
Yes, Maya Millett and Ben Greenberg. So Maya, on A Little Devil in America, which was my first Random House book, I freelance hired Maya. Maya was not working at Random House, but I just kind of wanted an outside editor. I wanted to work with a Black woman on the book, and given, the nature of that book and given what that book was doing, and someone just kind of recommended Maya to me, and we really worked really brilliantly together on a Little Devil in America. And when that book kind of had some success, Random House kind of brought Maya on as part of the team, and that's been, I think, I don't know. I'm not one who gives advice to writers. I'm not much of a writing advice person, but having some continuity. That this is the first book I've ever worked with the same team of people, 2 books in a row, and that continuity, I just think they just really changed the way this book existed, and I'm thankful for that. So yeah, Maya Millett and Ben Greenberg.
Okay, so when you have that 120,000 word draft that has poured out of you in this really kind of disciplined way, as you said, 4 days a week, 3,000 words a day, 2 months, and you get that draft done with a book that is doing as much as this book does, and the kind of writer that you are, lyrical, poetic, like we've been talking about, drawing through lines between disparate subject matter and disparate themes. I would imagine that there is a process editorially that you go through wherein, in order for the book to succeed in the way that this one does, you have to have a pretty firm grip on what it is.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? You have to zero in. I could imagine needing editors and having, especially if you have good ones, who can really help you winnow it down and focus it and give you the kind of feedback that you need to sharpen it and make it shine in subsequent drafts. Can you just talk a little bit about that process? And am I accurate in my thoughts on it?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, in a way, I think a big thing is that I didn't really know what it was. And then the first draft wasn't me trying to, I think another reason why the first draft was so long was the first draft wasn't me trying to figure out what it was. I didn't really wrestle or fight with the first draft. It was all kind of just about generating language and then knowing that once we got to the second draft, it would clarify. Now, materially, how that worked was, Maya did this thing where she branded some of the parts of the book me using quote unquote authoritative sports voice, which was really helpful because she was just pointing out areas where I was straight up just telling people about a game or talking to people about basketball as though they'd never seen basketball or heard of basketball before. And she, as someone who is not a basketball fan, was kind of like, this isn't actually inviting for me either. It's very off-putting. And also, it kind of turned my attention towards what I was avoiding talking about in those pockets, right? And what I was running from. in terms of this is maybe a place where I could talk a bit more about devotion or grief or particularly things about my father, these kind of things. And it wasn't just authoritative sports voice with sports. There was the third quarter begins with the image of me sitting in a field watching planes take off with my dad, which I really loved writing that. But that didn't exist in the first draft. What existed in the first draft was instead this really long and meandering thing about the Wright brothers, and some of that was good. But that's the thing about draft. I mean, it doesn't matter if it's good. It matters if it works. Some of it was good. I mean, it delved into how multiple states claim the birthplace of flight and, the Wright brothers and Dayton and all this stuff. But it was so long that it just really ate into this idea that I was trying to get at in that quarter about leaving and returns. And I realized that a more succinct way to do that would be to just write the scene with my father. But I was, for some reason, anxious to do that and avoiding it. And so there was some real, in between draft 1 and 2, for me, there's a lot of clarification in terms of what have you been afraid to write? What have you been running from? How can you find that ability to write those things? Because it's necessary. It's necessary to make a book that's cohesive and coherent.
Yeah, that tracks for me. I feel like between drafts 1 and 2, it's usually coming to grips with the things that we've been avoiding.
Yeah.
It's amazing. It's amazing how good writers are at that. It's like these things that I don't need to say that, or, you might have a hunch that it might need to be there. And then of course it does. It's like the very thing that people, like readers, are hungry to hear from or hear more about. And I want to talk to you a bit more about the way you work. You've been incredibly generative creatively over the past several years. And I read where you said, one thing that defines my life is that I'm really disciplined. I'm very beholden to my disciplines. So I know you're a runner, as are many writers I speak with on this show. I think there's something about the running life and the running mentality that squares with somebody who's really disciplined as a writer. I know too that when you set out on this latest book tour for this book, it coincided with Ramadan and you were fasting. And I think obviously that some of that is tied to Ramadan and religion, but I think some of it too might just be tied to like discipline and wanting, I just love to hear you talk about that in your personality, in your creative approach, and how it might serve you.
Yeah, I'm actually in the middle of a run right now. I'm like splitting the run. So after this, I'm going to get back at it. Well, I think for me, I'm pretty lazy. But I'm very disciplined. So those two things aren't at odds with each other. I think they serve each other, which in a very literal sense, it means that I would rather do nothing. I mean, left to my own devices, I would do nothing. Tomorrow morning, I'm getting in my car and I haven't had a moment to rest like at all for like 6 weeks, 6 consecutive weeks. And so tomorrow morning I'm getting in my car and driving to the mountains and I'm going to rest for a bit, but I'm still going to run, right? Because running, my desire to do nothing is often overwhelmed by my desire to be beholden to my disciplines that fulfill me in great many ways. And the practice of running for me, for example, I'm not someone who's a competitive runner anymore. Every year I go, well, should I run a marathon again? I haven't run one in a long time. It's been, I've run 2 in my life. And I think the last one I run was maybe 12 years ago. And so every year I go through a thing where I think, I could run. I do really long runs on Sundays, and some Sundays I'll run like 17 miles. And so ostensibly I could run a marathon physically, but I just don't really care to. I don't really want to. That's not why the discipline arrives for me. Discipline arrives for me because it is a space wherein I can make a couple hours in a day exactly what I want them to be. And that fuels my ability to reach for what is possible elsewhere on the page while, say, cooking, while spending time with my dog. These are all things I consider to be disciplines that I feel excited about. And when I feel excited about them, I know that this is different for many writers. I know a lot of writers who are like, oh God, writing is so dreadful for me. It's not dreadful for me. It's really joyful for me. And it needs to be, because it doesn't need to feel like I'm stepping out of a joyful life to do something I'm dreading. It really needs to feel to me like I'm exiting a joyful life to do something that also brings me pleasure in a different way. And I think for me, that's a requirement, because otherwise my work suffers. I can see, if I look back at, for example, the first draft of There's Always This Year, I can see parts on the page where I'm like, oh, I was not having a good day, and I pushed through anyway. And I don't want my work to reflect that. So I'm beholden to these pleasureful disciplines, in that if enough of them stitch together, then I have a pleasureful enough life and nothing feels like a break from it.
You have said too about your process. I'm one of those people who has multiple computer monitors.
Yeah, I guess.
Like I'm a fucking statistician or something. I'll pull up poems or excerpts from novels, and while I'm writing, I have a stack of books on my desk. I like not being alone. I think writing does not happen alone. If I'm writing in my house and I have an excerpt from Toni Morrison's Jazz up on my computer, then that means Morrison is in the room with me.
Yeah,
that's consistent from book to book. That's how you do it.
Yeah, I mean, I have fewer books on my desk right now because I'm not writing any. I'm not like in book mode. But I mean, the monitors are. I mean, right now I have a poem up on the monitor. Because I was working on a thing about Diane Seuss. So I have like a Diane Seuss poem up on the monitor. I have another monitor going. I'm pretty strategic about that. I have 3 monitors. On one monitor, the one that I'm looking at you in now, I usually have any kind of visual research I need, meaning like audio, video, YouTube, that kind of thing. On my central monitor is where I do my writing. So it's like, that's where the Word documents open. And on the other monitor, which is like in portrait mode, that's where I put any text-based research, or not even research, but just like pleasures to return to, the poems and novel excerpts. I think you have to, for me, I'm interested in populating my writing space with as many other voices as I can, the voices that help inform my own, and the voices that remind me that I am writing into a lineage that exists and requires me to be good.
It's like mission control.
Yeah, very much. Yeah.
That's interesting. This is very much a book about Ohio, as I've mentioned. It's about Columbus and your love for that place. And it's also about people in Ohio. Like you mentioned lineage, and we mentioned Toni Morrison. Like, she looms large over this book, I feel like, and has been a big influence. You also, at turns in this book, talk about Ohioans like John Glenn, Virginia Hamilton.
Yeah.
Obviously, there's the LeBron James, the basketball players. There's several. But I'd love to just talk a little bit about Ohio as a fellow Midwesterner. But I left, so I've been out on the West Coast for a long time. But you have stayed, and you write so beautifully about it, and have such an enviable, from my perspective, like deep connection to that place and knowledge of that place. Like, what is it about Ohio and the traditions that it has like kind of handed down to you that has kept you there all these years?
Well, I mean, it's a city that I think allowed me to survive, and it's a city I have survived, at least to this point. And I've had to survive many versions of myself here, and because of that, because many versions of myself are very much kind of peeled off and left behind, I don't want to abandon them, because to abandon them might also mean, in my case, to abandon the people who loved those versions well and helped pull them through to a better survival. And I adore, the people are very much the architecture of a place, I believe. And I've been lucky that I have found really great architecture here. And I don't want to try, in terms of like literally the people being the architecture of a place. There's just been an abundance of good architecture here that I'm not interested in seeking elsewhere, because I think I would be a lesser person trying to refine and rebuild that architecture elsewhere, because it's a challenge to do that. I envy people who move and can kind of sink right into a new community. It would be hard for me to do that. I'm an anxious person. It's just I'm not equipped for that. And I think because of that, I would be a worse person in any place other than this one. And as we know, if I were to be a worse person, I would be a worse writer. Those two things, for me at least, go very hand in hand. And so I do my best work here because I'm my best person here. And I think I'm drawn to that. I'm drawn to, and I'm challenged here. I'm also, I'm challenged to continually evolve and be better than I was. And I think that you can't get that everywhere.
You still have a lot of family there and a lot of friends you grew up with?
Kind of. I mean, my father's still here. Friends are tricky because Ohio, I mean, I mentioned in the book, Ohio's kind of a place people leave. Um, so I feel like it's interesting. I mean, as I get older, it just happens, your friends kind of scatter and you blink and it happens, I think. And I kind of touch on that in the book too. There are friends where it seemed like we were just around each other all the time. And now, we've got to visit each other in other places. And this becomes even more challenging. I think, I turned 40 last year and a lot of my friends are having children. And, so, there's many reasons why my friends leave, and there are many reasons why it becomes more urgent to come and see them, because they have children I'd like to say hi to, and they have growing families and they're evolving, and I don't want to miss out on their evolutions. So I would say that I don't have as many friends who have stayed, but it's allowed for me to kind of build up a network of care that extends beyond my own little bubble, as joyful as this bubble is. And I think that's useful because if I were not pushed to do that, I'd be very insulated here.
Yeah, I mean, I can relate. I grew up, like as I was saying, in Indiana, and pretty much every one of my best friends, with rare exceptions, left. Like everybody left to go away to school or to seek jobs elsewhere or whatever it is. It's the kind of place not a lot of people stayed. And I don't know. I can lament that sometimes because, as you were saying, it's hard to build that architecture. I've lived in Los Angeles for 20 something years. I don't think I still talk most on the phone with one of my best friends from growing up in Indiana. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I mean, that's how it ends up, right? I mean, I have a lot of love for Indiana. My niece plays high school basketball in Indianapolis, and so I go there. I'm there a lot, especially this year. She's had a great state tournament run, so I was there a lot. And it is, I think, looked at as a place that no one stays or no one makes a full life, and that's tough. That's a really tough thing.
May I ask, like, what high school? I'm just curious.
Yeah, Lawrence North.
Oh yeah, sure. So I know Lawrence North.
Sorry, I'm turning a light on. Yeah, she plays at Lawrence North. They won the state championship last year. I'm sorry, Lawrence Central. She plays at Lawrence Central.
Okay.
They won the state championship last year, and it was cool to see that, and especially in that city where it's a really big basketball town with a really big basketball history. It was really great to see that.
That's awesome. Good for her. So this book is also about making it and not making it, which is right. a very American theme. And there are players like we've talked about, like LeBron James, who obviously is the ultimate example of a guy who made it in basketball and in life. I mean, he's had such enormous success and has kind of always been a star, right? Or it seems that way. But there are other players with Ohio connections who you depict in this book who had varying degrees, who kind of traveled that arc to a lesser extent. Kenny Gregory. I want to say Michael Redd. Is Michael Redd a Columbus guy? Is that right?
Yeah, he is. I mean, he made it to the NBA, but yeah, he is. He's a Columbus guy.
Okay. And then Esteban Weaver is another player. I'm interested in hearing you talk about that particular theme, this idea of who makes it and who doesn't make it. In particular, I want to hear you relate it to your own personal and professional arc, which is extraordinary. You are, I think, by any measure, a writer who has made it. MacArthur Grant winner, incredible accolades for your books, book sales, huge turnout for your book tour. I mean, I hate to break it to you, but you're kind of you're a literary star. I mean, that's what's happening. And I think if you had dialed back, say 20 years and looked at where you were then, where I believe at that point you were unhoused.
Yeah.
You have traveled an incredible road and you have made it. But Is that how you conceive of it? What is it like to make it? Like, what about this idea
Yeah.
of who makes it and who doesn't?
I think it's easy for me to pontificate on that when thinking about sport and basketball and not myself. A lot harder to do when perhaps examining my own trajectory, though I suppose that's how it should be. But, you know, for a big part of what this book was trying to do too was to recontextualize what making it means, or to separate. It is a very American idea to make it in a material sense, to make it to the league, to make it. But I was thinking about someone like Esteban Weaver, who didn't even finish high school, but is so revered in this town still for what he offered for the time he was here, where I could go out on a basketball court and see some kids playing and say the name Esteban Weaver, and they would revere that name, even though they were not alive at all, not even conceived when he was playing. To me, that's making it. If your name still has some weight in the place where you became a person who loved something, I believe you've made it. Now, in terms of my own trajectory, it's best to not think about it, I guess. I only ever wanted to write one book. I wanted to write one poetry book, which was my first book. And, I got talked in, like, very much literally talked into a second book. Not saying that I was like, forcefully coerced, but I didn't really want to write They Can't Kill Us Till They Kill Us at first. And then I did. And I think that is, my life changed after that. And then my life changed again. So there's the reality that if you're doing work that you believe in, there's the chance that your life may change a lot. And the only way I kind of keep my head on straight, I think, is by moving forward with gratitude and hoping that through my work, I am broadening my capacity to see the world in some unique and careful and thoughtful ways. And that is also life-changing. Like, to spend a lot of time in the depths of this book and to think about literal time and mortality and what it is to watch a clock run out, that changed my worldview immensely. And the pursuit of this book changed the way I look at the people I love. And that, to me, is a life-changing pursuit. That is a lot more worthwhile to pursue than an award. Now, of course, I have of course I have gratitude for having, won a lot of things that a lot of authors don't ever get the chance to win. A lot of those things don't seem real to me. They don't seem, they seem very strange, like the Wyndham Campbell thing this year. All that stuff feels strange. But, that stuff is fleeting. It's joyful, but it's fleeting. I don't remember who won a MacArthur last year, let alone the year I won. I don't, and it's not because I don't care, but it's just because I'm very much like, what are you doing now? What's the work doing now? And so that's what I'm in pursuit of. And that is also a life-changing pursuit.
Yeah, you say, or you said in an interview, and I want to find the quote because it speaks to this really well. You say, quote, I really still, honestly, live in these 24-hour bursts, if I'm lucky. If I'm lucky. If I'm unlucky, if I'm struggling, then it's like the time is condensed. Can I get through 12 hours? Can I get through 8 hours? That's always been my brain. I think it's a bit healthier now. And I think that's actually, in some ways, a good way to be. It means you're closer to living in the moment than sitting around pondering something that happened 2 years ago.
Yeah,
but
it's certainly a way to be. But yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I am very much, I'm required to be an in the moment person. And I think that reflects in my work. I think the urgency of the in the moment reflects in my work.
Well, I want to talk a bit more about parts of the book where you depict yourself as a young man struggling with poverty, homelessness, coming into contact with legal trouble, incarceration, and then getting to a point where you began to write poetry. Can you just talk a little bit about decisions creatively to kind of go there, to address that part of yourself? I've read where you say this book is the most personal book you've ever written. Is that the part of it that you might be referring to, like that you might have shied away from a bit in previous work, or is it something else?
No, I think it's all of it. I mean, I think, I hadn't written about my father in any book really substantially in any book before this one. There are it just the book required that of me. The book required some stakes that felt like I was offering something of myself to help really drive this point home. This central question of these few central questions of what it means to stay in a place that you've survived in, that you've survived many modes of yourself in. What does it mean to make it against whatever odds are placed against you, and how to rewire and redefine making it. And broadly, what it is to kind of walk through a life that feels like a dream sometimes, because it feels like you've outlasted and outsurvived every version of yourself that you did not think you could. So in order to drive all of those points home, I don't know if I could have done it without saying, and here's very real examples from my living that required me to consider these things so deeply that I wanted to write a book about them. I don't think the book works if I say, I'm considering all these weighty things and I'm going to lens them through all of this other stuff that is not personal. The stakes aren't there. And that was what was happening in the first draft. It was me running away from a lot of that. And it required me to ask some real questions of, do you want to be afraid, or do you want to write a good book? And I landed on wanting to write a good book, or write the best book I could. And yeah.
So I am sure there are a lot of people who listen to my show who are writers themselves or trying to write books, and often struggling as writers do. And I think that a lot of the struggles that writers have can seem to pale in comparison to some of the struggles that you have had and have overcome. You talk about survival, and like, what is it? Can you point to things that helped you along the way, or things internally that you were able to access that got you from like living in the storage unit that you were living in, 20 years ago, to where you are now?
Yeah. Of course you're not supposed to live in a storage unit. So I only had 3 things in there. I had a mattress, a lamp, and like a tiny desk nightstandy thing. And I would bring a pen, and this was before I considered myself a writer. I didn't consider myself a writer till like 2011, or maybe 2010. But I would scribble things down. I would try to recreate small little essays I would write about albums I loved when I was a kid. I'm the youngest of 4. I spent a lot of time thinking about and just scribbling thoughts down about music. And because you're not supposed to live in a storage unit, I had to be very quiet. And so it's not like I could play songs, I couldn't play music in there. But I could relive something I loved about an album and recreate it in my head, and kind of write down notes and write down little things about so much of my writing practice, so much of my writing voice maybe got formed in that storage unit, because it was kind of me saying, I cannot go to this place, but I want to recreate it. And through my recreating it, I might feel transported to an elsewhere that is better than this. I think so much of my writing is not just nostalgia's sake. It's asking some real questions about not just nostalgia for nostalgia's sake. It's asking some real questions about the quality and methods of transportation through memory. And, memory can survive in some harsh places. And I learned that, I think, particularly during the time when I was unhoused and incarcerated, you really get an understanding for how memory survives and what memory can survive. And the way that it survived through me was kind of through writing out some things, and not considering myself a writer, but just considering myself who is in need of language.
There's a line in the book where you say nostalgia is a relentless hustler.
Yeah.
I feel like it's impossible, especially as a sports fan, when there's these great moments like the Cavs, and was it 2016? The 2016? Cavs Golden State.
Yeah.
I mean, how can you not be nostalgic for that as a sports fan? I'm not even a Cavs fan or a Golden State fan, and I'm nostalgic for it. I mean, that was just, that was all time great. But when you talk about considering yourself a writer, you look back on this time, you said 2011, possibly 2010. What was it that shifted?
I started to study poems. I started to learn about poems. And that was really vital for me. That was really expanded my worldview and expanded my capability of what I thought language could do. And I wanted to pursue that. I just wanted to write poems because it seemed like I could figure out how to use image and metaphor and reshape the world in a material way. And that was interesting to me. So I really sat heavily in pursuit of that.
There's an incredible musicality and lyricism to your writing. When you look back on this as the trajectory that your career has taken, do you feel fortunate that you started with poetry, like as part of your progression as a writer? Because it strikes me like, wow, I wish I would have done that.
Well,
You
I
know,
mean,
it's
yeah, I started honestly as a music critic, writing like music reviews for local and regional papers. But the issue was that I got told my writing was quote unquote too poetic. You know, at the time, reviewers are kind of just like, get to the point. So I am glad that I was told that. I was glad that before I even wrote a poem or picked up a book of poetry, someone said, I cannot publish you because your writing is too poetic. And I didn't take that as like I took offense to it because it meant that I couldn't get paid anymore. Um, but I didn't take offense to it. It really pushed me to say, oh, I need to study poems and to figure out how to hone this ability. And so, yeah, I mean, I'm thankful for that because I think there was maybe like a natural rhythm in lyricism to my work that just required honing, and poetry helped me hone it. Yeah.
there's another word that occurred to me as I was reading your book is like liberated or liberation or freedom. Like this musicality in the language and this kind of like it feels like free association, or it feels like, you're drawing these through lines between these things that on the surface seem far afield from one another. And it's thrilling. It's fun as a reader to be in the hands of a writer who's operating like that, because there's great velocity to it. There's great surprise on the page where you're like, oh, you're feeling these things kind of come together. It's like, it's great to watch the pieces click into place. And I'm wondering, I think, speaking personally, but I think also speaking for many people who try to do this, it can be hard to get to that place of real freedom where you're kind of, you're really in it and you're also focused, but you're not restricted in a way that might inhibit the work. How do you access that so consistently?
I think for me, it's being okay with failure and understand, this book, I wanted to make a book that looked like nothing that I'd ever seen before. And just the pursuit of that meant that I did not know what failure would be. I'd maybe know it when I saw it, but I wouldn't see it unless I wrote towards it pretty vigorously. Um, and I'm unafraid of that. I'm unafraid of, Little Elven America. I really like that book. There was almost a finished draft of it that just didn't work, and I took it back and rewired it. I just really think I learned through. I don't have any quote unquote formal training in writing, and so I learned through failures. And I think for me, freedom is saying I'm not to quote Nina Simone, freedom is no fear. So to say I'm not afraid of failure and I'm actually eager to see what revelations failure can offer me, that's a real freedom. There's a real freedom to that I'm always eager to pursue.
And you mentioned a bit ago that early on in your career, after the publication of that first poetry collection, you were sort of coerced into writing the next book.
Mm-hmm.
By whom?
Well, my pal Brett worked at $2 Radio. $2 Radio published that book, and he kind of kept pushing me about doing it. And $2 Radio, they're based in Columbus. So I met up with them and we talked, and I was still on the fence, but I was kind of just like, well, okay, we'll see how it goes. The plan with They Can't Kill Us So They Kill Us was really, or at least my thought was, we'll sell it's an Ohio press. I'm an Ohio author. We'll sell a couple thousand books in Ohio if I'm lucky, and then we'll go from, I'll move on and keep working my little 9 to 5, and that'll be that. But no, I mean, of course, that book, of course, has changed my life, changed the trajectory of my life. Yeah.
You were working at a diner, I think, when you first started writing.
Yeah, it was like a breakfast lunch diner, which was great. The hours were perfect for me because this was at a time in my life where my schedule was kind of like, I would go in at around 6 a.m. and work until noon, 1, and then go home and sleep, and then wake up at around 7, 6 or 7, sometimes 5, and then just write, and then go out at night, like go to a show or whatever, and then stay up and write all night and then go to work. So I wasn't sleeping at night. I was sleeping in the afternoon, and it was kind of just a really good, not the healthiest practice, but it was, it was a good routine.
And is that when you wrote "They Can't Kill Us Till They Kill Us"?
No, at that point I was working a 9 to 5. I worked at like a healthcare startup. It was the first, it's hard to get a job when you have a record, like criminal record or whatever. And so that I got that job, and I was like clinging to it because it was the first serious 9 to 5 I had with benefits, and so I was working a 9 to 5. Yeah, and it was like, this is just going to be my job forever, I guess, because that's all there is.
And then when "They Can't Kill Us Until They Kill Us" comes out, can you just talk about the shift? Like, when did you feel things changing in a serious way for you?
It's funny. I kind of didn't, which I know is funny, but I didn't. I didn't quit my job until, so "They Can't Kill Us, They Kill Us" came out in November 2017. I didn't quit my job until May of the next year. And it was because I had signed to write the Tribe Called Quest book, and I got a big enough advance that I could pay my rent for a year. It was like only a big enough advance to pay my rent for the year. But I thought, if I can pay my rent for the year, I could probably quit my job and just figure out what I need to figure out. But so I felt a shift in these kind of logistical ways. But in terms of my life shifting, I don't know. I never, the crowds got a little bigger for my readings, which is just a gradual thing that's continued to happen. The crowds get a little bigger. You are maybe recognized a bit more. These things you sense, but it doesn't. I don't know. Maybe I'm probably bad. It's probably just something I don't think about in any way, but I'm sure it's happening. But yeah, it's not something I sense. Yeah,
I can tell you. I know it's harder to sort of. I can imagine it's harder to grasp it all when you're the person at the kind of eye of the storm. But from the outside looking in, from 2017 to now, a lot has happened.
yeah.
And when you go out on book tour, like this tour that you just did for this very book, hundreds of people showing up, right?
Yeah. I mean, we had, and some of this is a lack of preparation on my part, and it would serve me, I think, to be more aware, because, a couple nights on book tour, we had to do I chose to do back-to-back shows. So like New York on the 26th, the day the book came out, we booked that show at the Bell House in New York, which holds about 375 people. And it sold out really quickly. I mean, within a day. And so I thought, okay, Random House and I put our heads together. So we'll do a second show. Probably won't sell out, but then that show sold out. So it was like that in Portland. We did 2 back to back because the venue sold out really quickly. So I think, the last time I toured was also 2019, because for Little Devil in America, I was mostly virtual. So I was a little bit, I didn't know what to expect, but yeah, a lot had changed. I mean, we had 800 plus people in Seattle and 500 in LA, and so it's a different thing, I think.
That's not normal.
Yeah.
for a book tour, it's not. I mean,
yeah,
people go. I talk to a lot of authors, and they're like, "God, thank God there were like 10 people at Book Soup or whatever." But I think, would probably say that it's a combination of the previous books having taken even further hold and kind of found their way into the hands of more readers since they had been published.
Sure.
That generates buzz and excitement for this book. There's obviously been a great critical reception for this book. All of these things working together, I build enthusiasm and people turning out. I've heard you describe your approach to book tour as being more like a musician. You think of these events as shows rather than readings. And this maybe is also tied to your background as a poet and like the spoken word scene. Is that right?
I would say so. Yeah. And I also just came up around musicians, and still a lot of friends with a lot of musicians. But yeah, I mean, it's a performance in a way. And I think if done well, it's a chance to really engage the audience. I mean, in Seattle, I had no conversation partner. And for the second New York show, for the second Portland, for some of these, it was just me on a stage for an hour and a half, reading a bit. So it's not even a traditional event. It's not a traditional book event, which I think follows the let's put you in conversation with a person model, which is fine. But that's not, I think, the best possible way to engage my work. And so, a lot of these shows were just me on stage, sitting on the stage, reading, and then kind of sitting down on the stage and talking to people like for 45 minutes straight. And that's enjoyable to me. I trust the people who read my work to come with really good, thoughtful questions, varied questions, very varied questions. And we can have a good time just off that. We can laugh together, and we can think together, and we can feel together. And that's a part of the book tour model that has really been effective for me this time out.
So it's like a Q&A. You read and then you sit and you start to just dialogue with people, or is it
Yeah.
more form?
No, it's really laid back. I mean, it's really laid back. And of course, on this tour, there were stops where I was in conversation with people, because that is also something that I think, in both of those models work well. But I think for me, I love reading the work, and I love being in conversation with people, actual people who are out. So, yeah, we had a lot of fun. I had a lot of fun this book tour. This tour was, I mean, I'm very exhausted, and I'm very eager to be, just like alone for a bit, because it's been, but it was worthwhile. And I mean, I'm going back out again in the fall, because there's only so many cities you could hit. And the two options were, for me, at least the two options were, go on the road from like March until July and just hit everywhere, that's just untenable for me, like deeply untenable for me. Or it was like, go out from maybe March to early May, late March, early May, and then go back out in late August to November and do it again.
And so when you're in dialogue, like having kind of like, I'm catching you at the end of all this. So thank you again for like talking with me.
Yeah, of course.
Sure, it's the last thing you probably want to do. But when you are reflecting now on the tour and all of this interaction you had, direct interaction you had with people who have read this book and engaged with other books, and then you consider like the success that you've had and what I guess you could call like a meteoric rise. I mean, it's not that long ago, 2017 to now. A lot has happened. When you hear from readers directly, does that give you a sense of why your work is resonating so deeply and so widely with people? Do you have an idea of it?
Yeah, well, I get an idea of it. There are two things. One, notoriously, my signing lines are very long, and always have been. But this tour, I mean, we're pushing like 2.5 hours some nights, but it's because I don't sit behind a table. I stand up usually, and I just like talking to people. I like, and not even about, you don't have to come up to me and be like, I love your work and fawn over my work. That's fine, obviously, but I'm interested. I'm more interested when people are like, you wrote about this song. Here's my experience with this song. It's different than yours, but I'd like to share it with you, because it reminds me that I'm writing in a way to fulfill a desire to connect with people. I grew up, I'm the youngest of four. Like I mentioned, I grew up spending a lot of time alone with music and a lot of time alone with popular culture. And it's really cool to now step into a world where I don't feel like I'm at all alone with those things, and that I'm writing into a collective of people who have sometimes a completely disparate relationship with it, but one that still feeds into the relationship that I've built. So that is one very big thing. Two, to hear from other people about how your work impacts them, if you are lucky, can reframe your own ideas about what your work is doing. So for me, this book tour was fascinating, because almost every night in every city, sometimes more than once, I would hear stories about how some part of my work helped someone fall in love with someone else. Like, a husband and wife would come up and be like, oh, we bonded over this. Or someone would come up with their partner and say, oh, we ran into each other and bonded over this. We got matching tattoos, that kind of thing. That was really refreshing to me, because I never thought of my work as something that could bring that many people together, reaching into it and pulling out a desire for love. And so that was incredible for me. That was incredibly clarifying and rich. To say, wow, like there's a world wherein my work is doing things that I just had no idea it was doing.
I was going to say, like the surprise of it, where you're like, I can imagine like when you have that many people reading your books and showing up at your events, that not only do you hear things from people that you didn't expect to hear in terms of how the work was landing, but also the kinds of people for whom the book is really deeply meaningful.
Mm-hmm.
I can remember years ago having a book come out, and I think I was at my grandmother's funeral, but there was an old lady at the wake who came up to me and was like, I read your book, like kind of slapped me on the back and said, I read. And I was just like, what? Like, like, I'm sure you've had that happen where somebody comes up to you and you're just like, I had no idea that this book was going to reach this person.
Yeah. I mean, and part of that for me is because once the book is in the world, I tend to want to lose touch with it. It's no longer mine. It belongs to people, people who I don't know and may never find, may never seek out, may never run across. And so it's always pleasurable to encounter living people who are engaging with the work, because it reminds me that the work exists in a way that is touchable for someone. Because truly, when a book comes out, I kind of say, okay, well, we've had our time together, and now you're everyone's. But I also don't think about the everyone, you know. So it's great when the everyone kind of crystallizes into something material and good.
So this is very much a book. I want to underline for people listening who might not be sports people that this is not a book that you have to be a sports person to enjoy. It's a critical point. It's, I think you can know nothing about basketball and read this book and find the basketball passages beautiful and moving and relatable in a human way, because like we've been talking about, it's about so much more than just the game of basketball or just LeBron James. Like there's a lot happening here.
Yeah.
And it's also a book that's very much about time. And it's a book that's about loss, which is related to time and is something that we haven't really discussed yet. You have experienced a lot of loss in your life. Your mother passed away when you were young. I believe it was 1997.
Yep. Yeah, so I was 13.
So you were 13 years old. And I believe that she is very much on your mind in this book. A lot of the people, friends that you've lost in your life, factor into the equation. But can you just talk a little bit about time and loss and its presence in this book, but also how time and loss have shaped you? Like how loss in particular has shaped you and has shaped kind of your worldview. We mentioned earlier how you kind of live in these discrete small units of time, 8 hours, 12 hours. I imagine that I can relate. I think like having experienced loss makes you have a heightened sensitivity to time.
Well, and not only that, for me, I think so much of my life is colored through a desire to seek gratitude and to find gratitude and to have and hold on to gratitude. And that to me is it's really tied to my definitive relationship with loss and wanting to feel grateful for my ability to remain and for who else remains. And and I think it also, these two things tie together. I think having lost people very young, having lost friends very young, there was never really a point. There was only a small point in my life before people my age began to die. And I kind of walk out of every moment of that grief saying, what will I do? What do I get to do with the rest of my time here? Knowing that there's no clock, I can't tell. There's no clock over my head that tells me what that time will be. What will I do with my 1 good hour or 2 good hours I can squeeze out of a day? How can I make myself the best possible version of myself? These kind of things feel important. These kind of things feel, and these are the things that I think I build that have been born out of my relationship to loss, is wanting to take a richer accounting for how I'm living on an hour-to-hour basis.
I read where you said, quote, "I'm not a very committed religious person, but I am someone who is committed most vigorously to a belief in the afterlife."
Yeah. Well, you hope that somewhere some people are waiting for you to arrive. You hope the people you love are maybe waiting for you to arrive in a place that you can't yet see, but will maybe get to see. Yeah, I think that I am satisfied. It helps me move through the world if I believe that, I suppose.
And so a couple more questions, and then I'm going to let you go and let you just go to the mountains. I want you to be in the mountains.
Yeah.
But does LeBron James have a copy of this book? I want him to have a copy. Do you know if he's gotten it?
I don't know. I of course, without, Random House did the due diligence of trying to get him a copy, and I wrote him a letter. We did all the things you do. You're right. You know how this goes. You do all the things you do to get people, but I don't know. I would imagine. Well, he was very busy up until about a week ago. So maybe, I guess we'll see. My thought is, if he does have one, we will know by the off season. But I also have thought in that if I were him, I would not want to read this book. Not out of any kind of spite or I just, it does engage with his life in some. I know this is not a LeBron James book, but it does engage with his life in some depth. Or he's at the center of a book of great depth about life and loss, and it might be just too fluorescent for him to be close to. It would be for me, I think, if I were him.
I'm going to push back. I think that actually it might be deeply interesting to him as an Ohio kid of the same generation, and to be in the hands of such a gifted writer like you, who is contextualizing the experience of that time in that place. I don't know. I have a feeling he would be really moved by it, but it's like you say, he's got to be in the off season, maybe when he's on vacation or something.
I think you're right. Like, I think that's been the consensus. Your thought has been the consensus. And I think what I am doing is being like, he wouldn't like it. I'm kind of like preemptively, but I think you're right, and because I've said the similar thing a couple of times where it's like, well, he wouldn't, if I were him, I wouldn't read it. And everyone's kind of like, I don't know. I think there's something in there for him. But we don't know yet. I know that we've sent copies, we've done all the things, and I guess we'll see one day.
Yeah. Well, if he ever decides to write a memoir and he needs a ghostwriter to collaborate with him on it.
Yeah.
They better come knocking on your door. Like, I cannot imagine anybody. I don't know if you'd want to do it, but you'd be the perfect person to help tell that story.
Ghostwriting is tough work. Ghostwriting can be a tough task. Yeah. Or so I've heard. I guess I've never done it, but I've heard.
I've talked with a couple ghostwriters this past year on this show. It's interesting work. It's not easy to do it well.
To do it well, that's the thing. To do it well, I think is a real brutal challenge.
So, last thing I want to ask you about is that you have a dog. I think you mentioned it earlier, and your dog is part Border Collie, part Great Dane, and her name is Wendy.
Yeah, yeah.
I am obsessed with Border Collies. It's like my life love. I had one when I was younger, and I was joking just yesterday on Twitter. I was like, I spend 40% of my free time watching Border Collie puppy videos.
Yeah.
So I don't know, and I'm also just a dog person, but a Great Dane / Border Collie. That's quite a mix.
It is. Wendy's going to be 8 in 3 days. She's having her birthday, and she's very sweet. She's very large and very smart, but as this goes, sometimes not smart enough to realize how large she is. So there's a lot of the collapse. Great Danes kind of, they lean on you and they collapse on you, and so there's a lot of that from Wendy. But she's been great. This is our 5th year together. And I feel like I've really learned a lot about the world through Wendy's sense of wonder and her bravery. I mean, when I got her, she was a very anxious dog who was very afraid of everything. And I've gotten to watch her become really brave. And I think through watching that, I've gotten to become a little bit braver too. And so she's the best dog. I love her so much.
Awesome. Well, it has been a joy to talk with you. And I'm just blown away by this book. It's a wonderful book. Congratulations on it. All of the success that you've had. And I'm wishing you rest and solitude.
Thank you. It was a real pleasure to talk with you. And thanks for reading the book so closely. This is a real pleasure.